Hello, it's Scott Manley here. It's November 22nd. For the first time in a long time, I don't have anything to do this weekend, which is good because I have a lot of deep space updates to bring you. Let's start with the rocket launches. Now, in the last couple of weeks, we had 8 Starlink launches, 7 from the East Coast, that's 3 from Slick 39A, and 4 from Slick 40. One was from Vandenberg, and on the 15th, we actually had 2 Falcon 9s launching Starlink within 3.5 hours of each other. So it was impressive to watch these things launch and pretty much come back into port in quick succession. But for the rest of the rocket launches, we go back to 8th of November. A Long March 11H was launched on a platform out in the Yellow Sea carrying Xi'an 32. 1, 2, and 3, so 3 satellites going to low Earth orbit. This was a morning launch. It had a really cool, like, jellyfish view in the sky. It did, however, take them about 7.5 hours to confirm that this was a success. Also, they told us that these satellites will primarily be used for conducting experiments in new space technology, so no real information there. 9th of November, we have Kinetica 1 launching Chuchian 2, and that says 1 and 2 of those, so there's 2 of those there, launching into sun-synchronous orbit from Jichuan. This is the 10th launch of the Kinetica 1 launch vehicle. So these satellites were supposed to do like Earth observation with a focus on water resources, and of course, the usual thing about applying these to disaster prevention, management of crops, things like that. 10th of November, we had a Long March 12 launching Guowang, 9 of those satellites. These are low Earth orbit communication satellites, similar to Starlink. And this launched from the Hainan Commercial Launch Facility. So this is only the third launch of Long March 12. It's a kerosene, oxygen, 2-stage, 10 tons to liquid to low Earth orbit. It uses the YF-100K first stage engine, which is like an oxygen-rich staged combustion engine. 10th of November, we had in China, again, Series 1 launching from Jichuan, carrying the Jilin, Gaofen, and Pingfei, and all that. And I don't really need to know how to pronounce those things because the mission unfortunately failed. It sounds like the 4th stage. This is a 4-stage solid rocket motor with the final stage being a liquid trim engine. And it failed during that. So they actually published the investigation already. So during the burn, the high temperatures apparently damaged insulation around the solenoid controlling the valve control. And as the insulation get damaged due to the heat, they had a short circuit, and that caused the valve to close and the engine to shut down early, leading to a loss of the mission. So they're going to make some changes to make sure that doesn't happen. And finally, 13th of November, we have New Glenn, and boy, it has been New Glenn's story the last couple of weeks. It has been very exciting. So first it was going to launch on the 10th. I was at a conference. We were sitting at brunch watching this for a very long time because it never went. It was a scrub, and it was a scrub because of weather, ground support equipment, and a cruise ship cruising through. They also, a couple of days later, they were going to get ready to launch, and then they cancelled the launch because of excessive solar activity. So they cancelled because of solar weather. Finally, on the Thursday, 13th of November, they launched, and it was the first daytime launch for New Glenn, the first actual payload launch. And we had amazing video coverage of the booster all the way through. Like, we had a fantastic view of the descent down from WB-57. Many of us thought it had initially missed the barge, but then it landed successfully. Crowd went wild. It looks absolutely beautiful. We've already seen the booster come all the way back to port. It looks very clean compared to a Falcon 9 because a Falcon 9 is using these gas generator engines that's burning kerosene. A lot of soot is getting generated, and that sticks to the side of the rocket. New Glenn is running methane. It's using a staged combustion engine, and that stuff isn't polymerizing. So they do have some damage. It looks like paint has got stripped off, but some of that appears to have happened prior to the launch. Some of this is actually visible as the vehicle is ascending off the launch pad. The payload, of course, was the pair of Escapade satellites, 2 very small satellites on a very big rocket. And, those are successfully on their way, not quite to Mars, but they will be on their way to Mars when they fly by the Earth next. So yeah, it came back into port on Jacqueline, and of course everyone's photographing it. We see a lot of the team that worked on the rocket posing next to it. See Jeff Bezos with his wife, like saying, "Hey, look what I built, honey." It's definitely a lot of excitement surrounding this, and as I said, it came back, and as it rolls back in, we get to see some of the hardware that they've used to secure it to the deck. There's like a system that's been placed underneath it, which is clearly there to like support the rocket, and it looks like it's been welded to the deck further. But since then, they've taken it off, they've returned it to the horizontal, rolled it back to the hangar for refurbishment, and I'll be excited to see what goes on next. And Blue Origin have not been shy about what's happening next at Blue Origin. Suddenly, they have a lot of announcements of cool things, but we'll get to those later. Now, soon afterwards, from the Cape, we also had the Atlas V, a 551 carrying Viasat 3. And this is a geostationary communication satellite, which is going to be used for satellite internet. So entering into a market which it may not be dominant. It's no longer dominant, let's say. So this is a second of three. It is covering the Americas. There's one more that's supposed to go. But this is going to be the last geostationary launch by the Atlas. Yes, all the other Atlas launches are low Earth orbit. They're either like Starliners or Kuiper. More on that later. So yeah, I mean that is the end of a huge legacy. That geostationary satellites being launched by Atlas. We've had such a long history of this going back decades, and now it's no more. Of course, Vulcan will be picking up the slack for ULA, and other companies are doing the GEO launches. Anyway, 17th of November, we had Falcon 9 launching Sentinel-6B. That's a satellite that's doing Earth resources in a low Earth orbit for NASA, NOAA, ESA. This is the 500th successful reflight of a used rocket, right? So this is, another 500th, is it landmark or whatever, right? So the Sentinel spacecraft is a radar altimetry satellite which is going to sit in sun-synchronous orbit, actually low Earth orbit, and it basically is mapping the surface of the Earth. It does a bit of synthetic aperture radar and things like that, but it's primarily looking at very accurate altitude. So it can actually see changes in sea level over time, for example. Anyway, on 19th of November, we had a Long March 2C launching Xi'an 30, A, B, and C. Again, 3 satellites out of Jichuan. This is into low Earth orbit, and the official word is that these 3 satellites are for space environment measurement and related technological testing purposes. 20th of November, Rocket Lab kind of surprised everyone by suddenly deciding to launch a satellite for Black Sky. Black Sky 22 out of Mahia into like low Earth orbit. This is a reconnaissance satellite, a private reconnaissance satellite. Actually, Black Sky, one of the cool things they posted recently was an image that their satellite took from space of the Dubai Air Show, capturing a number of like jets flying in formation. Yeah, your private reconnaissance is quite amazing these days. And then, yesterday, 21st of November, we had a Long March 3B/E launching out of Xichang, carrying a Chongshu Jishuxian, which is a geostationary communication satellite. It's primarily being used for testing. So this is for China's military defense. We're not sure what it does, but it's been found in a inclined supersynchronous orbit. So this is interesting because the orbit is 51 degrees inclination, and it goes out to like 40,000 kilometers. So that's not a normal orbit for a GEO transfer, but it could well be explained by using a slightly lower fuel consumption trajectory. Also, Rocket Lab on the 18th came out with a HASTE launch, a mission called VAN, or Prometheus Run, from the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport. So they basically announced, yes, we've had another HASTE launch out of Launch Complex 2, and this was in collaboration with the Defense Innovation Unit and the Missile Defense Agency to obviously test technologies for missile defense. This is the 6th time they have launched the HASTE satellite, and Chris Lemary happened to be there with his cameras, and he caught the first time, I think he's the first person to catch an Electron rocket transiting the sun during launch. So that's some pretty cool footage. We interrupt this news broadcast to bring an important message from, well, me. Hi, many of you know that I left my day job like a few months ago, and you have been very gracious in asking how you can support this thing that I do on the internet. And a lot of you have signed up for my Patreon. Very happy about that. But a lot of you have been asking about merchandise. I've not been great at that. I've done a few t-shirts over the years. Well, I commissioned an artist to do another one, and it'll be ready to ship in time for Christmas. This is based on when I went flying earlier in the year with Jared Isaacman, and basically it's me in the back of a plane, inverted, throwing the rock and roll, hand gesture. So yeah, this is this is not a barrel roll. This is rock and roll. So yeah, the shirts are going to be produced by Bonfire. I've worked with them before. They did Check Your Staging, and they also did the Nothing Is Beyond the Kraken, which were very popular shirts. And I still have those, are in good condition, so I expect the same this time. They basically collect all the orders, and at a certain cutoff date, they will then actually print and ship those. So the cutoff, I believe, is December 6th, and that will ensure that they get delivered for Christmas, which is obviously very important around this time of year. So if you want one of those shirts, follow the links, go check it out, and I really appreciate it. And of course, now back to the news. Talking about the future, Pegasus. Yes, Pegasus was the first air-launched rocket that has been, well, it's not the first, but it's the first one that was definitely successful. It's been launched since the 90s. It was actually the first commercially developed rocket. And it has largely been sitting doing very little since SpaceX has come along and stolen all its market. Well, a company called Catalyst is going to launch a spacecraft to save the Neil Gehrels Swift Observatory. So they have this satellite which has to go up into the same orbit as Swift. And the problem with Swift is that it's in a 20-degree inclination orbit. And while it's cheaper to launch satellites on a Falcon 9 on a rideshare mission, they don't go to a 20-degree inclination orbit because that's actually lower inclination than any of the launch sites that they work from. So Pegasus kind of fits this role. Apparently they're going to take off from the Kwajalein Atoll and launch it into this target orbit so it can rendezvous with the Swift Observatory and give it a reboost. And that is the last Pegasus that is in storage as far as we know. So that's the end of an era when that goes next year. Now, technically, Pegasus hasn't stopped being offered. And it is interesting that the rocket engines that are used, or solid rocket motors, are actually still being manufactured because they're used for other things like missile interceptors and, of course, the Pegasus, sorry, not the Pegasus, the Minotaur, which takes a Minuteman and puts a bunch of Pegasus stages on top of it. So it's possible that Pegasus could return again, but it's highly unlikely. So I'm going to consider this the last gasp for Pegasus. In China, Shenzhou 20 returned to Earth with Commander Cheng Dong, Chen Jian'er, and Wang Ji, and they took a week longer than expected to return to Earth. And if you remember, they had this whole thing where they were cooking, meat on their space station, and everyone was, saying, "Isn't that great to have these creature comforts?" Well, they didn't want the astronauts to become the cooked meat because there was a problem with the Shenzhou 20 spacecraft. After they were checking it out for return, they found one of the windows was cracked. Now, there's 3 panes of glass in there, but this was the outside one that's supposed to handle the heat of re-entry. If they had gone in with this, they considered it was a chance that the inner 2 panes would break, and then that would evacuate the capsule. There's a pretty good chance the crew would actually survive that because you've got multiple layers of protection, and they are wearing spacesuits. But all the same, they didn't want to take this risk, and so they sent the Shenzhou 20 crew home in the Shenzhou 21. Now, the Shenzhou 21 crew are still on orbit with this damaged spacecraft, but next week we are expecting Shenzhou 22 to launch early and provide them a lifeboat, and then presumably 21 will come back with some cargo or whatever. So yeah, that's China being able to very rapidly respond to a problem with a spacecraft. Now, on the other hand, I've just heard in the last 24 hours or so, actually, Eric Berger announced this, that there's now no one at NASA, no astronauts at NASA officially assigned to fly on Starliner at this point. So presumably, if it does fly again, it'll be at most a cargo mission, although that may then lead it back into actually flying again with people. Like Scott Tingle, if you remember, a couple of weeks ago, he was officially became the head of the astronaut office. And the other people that were involved, like Luke Delancey, is now scheduled to fly on SpaceX's Dragon. So yeah, that's kind of crazy. Also, We're back into the politics. Yeah, important news, right? We all know that Jared is back. Well, he has to go through another Senate confirmation hearing. That is going to be December 3rd. He's been pretty quiet on social media, and I fully expect that this is because he is going around talking to senators, trying to like reassure them that he will do the right thing and trying not to say that he's going to take money away from their districts, because there is this whole thing where we'd really like to not have SLS, but a lot of senators really want to spend the money that goes to SLS in their districts. Yeah, you know, of course, we're rooting for this. I think he'll be a great option. And so now, talking about the politics, I did actually see an interesting account of the sort of backroom workings of how this renomination happened. So, you know, if you remember, Jared's nomination got pulled after the fight with Elon, and there was an insider on the Trump panel or whatever who called Sergio Gore, and he was like, yes, let's get back at Elon by pulling his NASA nominee. And that was unfortunate, and it meant there was no one lined up to run NASA. So, you know, a few weeks, months later, Sergio is supposed to be nominated to be an ambassador to India. And a senator from Montana, Tim Sheehy, says, I'm not going to vote for him. Suddenly there's a whole lot of panic because they want like a unanimous set of votes, or enough votes to make this happen. And he basically makes the case that you can't just like leave the director, the administrator of NASA floating like that. And so that led to, you know, of course, Sean Duffy getting appointed, but that's like not a full-time job. Anyway, there's a story about that. I found it kind of interesting. And I also found it especially interesting because I met Tim basically when I was flying with Jared. In fact, we were flying in the same formation at one point, which is kind of fascinating. Anyway, of course, back to Blue Origin. Now, yes, Blue Origin, they have their motto, gradatim ferociter, right? It's step by step, ferociously. Well, there's been a whole lot of gradatiming for a long time. Now we're finally getting to see some ferocitoring, right? All the ferocitoring that we can handle. So soon after they came back to port, yes, we got all those great pictures. We got it, you know, rolling back and getting adjusted and collected and secured. Blue Origin announced an aerobraking heat shield, a deployable heat shield, right? Which is something like there's a 10-meter version and a 16-meter version. So this is a fabric like heat shield that can massively increase the cross-section of a payload to make it possible to land very large masses on Mars. That's one of the problems with landing on Mars, is the heat shield, the atmosphere is so thin that the heat shield needs to be very large, and the heat shields that you can fit in a rocket simply aren't large enough to land the kind of payloads on Mars that we would like. So that's a really cool idea, but I will point out that if you've got like a 16-meter plus heat shield that you can fold up inside a second stage booster, or the second stage of a rocket, it is potentially possible that you could convert this into some way to recover the rocket itself. And that is one thing that New Glenn lacks, is the ability to recover its second stage. Maybe this is some moves towards that. Nevertheless, it's an interesting technology. So the next thing they announced was a series of upgrades to New Glenn. If you remember when it took off, it did so with, well, very gradatim kind of energy. It seemed to be agonizingly slowly clawing its way up off the pad, but it did obviously perform as required. Well, they are announcing upgraded engines for which will be slowly phased in over time, as I imagine. So the BE-4, it currently generates 550,000 pounds of thrust. That's about 250 tons, I think. And they've already increased that by 75,000. They expect that pounds. So they expect that it'll probably get up to about 300 tons of thrust. And one of the ways they're going to do this is by using subcooled propellant. This is what SpaceX does for the Falcon 9 and what they do for Starship. So it makes total sense that Blue Origin will start doing this. The BE-3U upper stage engines, those are getting a massive increase, something like 30, 50, I don't know, big increase in its performance. So that will massively increase the performance that they are able to get out of this rocket, and it'll hopefully make it get off the launch pad a bit more quickly. The CEO, David Limp, actually pointed out that the BE-3U engine is now the highest thrust-to-weight hydrogen-oxygen engine in history, with a thrust-to-weight ratio of 90. But it doesn't stop there, because they have announced the New Glenn 9x4. So that means 9 BE-4 engines in the first stage and 4 BE-3U engines in the second stage. This is slated to be able to carry 70 tons to low Earth orbit, 14 tons to geosynchronous orbit direct, and 21 tons to translunar injection orbit, right? This will have a much bigger fairing. This will have an 8x7 meter fairing, which means that you can put bigger payloads on New Glenn 9x4 than you can currently put into Starship with a PEZ dispenser. It will be wider than what SpaceX can handle, and because of the structural requirements for Starship. I kind of thought that might happen. Well, it looks like they may make this happen one day. What I find also interesting is to fit those extra engines, those 2 extra engines into the first stage. It doesn't look like they're making the thrust section any bigger, but that does mean they need to make room, and the 6 landing legs are now mounted to the outside of that in their visualizations. So yeah, they have big plans, and this thing, obviously, it's not really competing against Starship. I mean, it is competing against Starship, but it is pretty much making SLS completely redundant by this point. I don't know, they shouldn't be bothering with this exploration upper stage. They should take a Blue Origin upper stage and put it on SLS, if anything. Finally, they posted pictures yesterday of Blue Moon Mark 1 getting ready to go to the moon. Yeah, we had a bunch of the team, including, of course, Jeff, standing out in front of it. It's the flight vehicle. It's going to land near Shackleton Crater. They'll be doing like their integrated checkout tests and everything. I'm not sure when the launch has happened, but it's supposed to be flying on the same booster that flew last week. It's possible. It would be very cool to see this. It's obviously not as big as the Mark II lander, which is going to carry humans to the moon, but this is huge. This is the tallest lander. It's bigger than the lander that put humans on the moon back in the 1960s and 70s. So this is big. Okay, and one other slightly related piece of news is Amazon's Kuiper program. Well, Kuiper was the code name. Now it is officially called LEO because it's in low Earth orbit. I mean, I always thought that Kuiper was kind of a silly name because very few people knew who Kuiper was. And I always like to point out that Kuiper didn't actually discover the Kuiper Belt. He said it shouldn't exist. And there were other people like Edgeworth that said it should exist. So, Kuiper, wrong image, whatever. It's called LEO now. In Texas, Firefly has announced that they know why their booster failed on the test stand. It was a process integration error where they ended up with some propellant still in some lines, and as they were trying to set things up, it caused a fire, and the fire ultimately ended up destroying the rocket. So that was unfortunate, but their test infrastructure and everything is still okay. They've got another booster that they're getting ready to, for the next launch. So okay, they're going to try again, and hopefully they're going to launch. The other, well, surprising failure in Texas just happened on Thursday night. Yeah, I got up Thursday night around 4 a.m. so I could go and try and take some photos of Comet Atlas with my telescopes, and put on my red dressing gown, as you imagine, to keep warm, and then checked on Twitter and saw that, yes, Booster 18, which had just rolled to the test site at Massey's, had a bit of an RUD, blowing out the side of the rocket. And that is unfortunate. The whole rocket has lost a huge amount of material around the lower oxygen tank. The rest of the tank is sitting up on top of it. It looks kind of precarious like that, with a lot of the weight being supported by this big, large transfer tube up the middle. Now, we've got some more photos from flypasts that now give us a better idea of what's happened to it. It looks like the origin of the event, it's sort of unzipped along this section where one of the chines were. These are like external structures on the outside that are arranged for aerodynamics, but they also include the composite overwrapped pressure vessels. And we know that we previously had a problem with one of those on Starship 36. Well, I thought like maybe it was just a simple welding issue because of the way these things attach, but the more I look, the more I'm leaning towards COPVs. What I saw was an image from, from Jordan Goodry, who managed to get a photo, and it looks like from this photo, it's really hard to tell because it's a still, that there may be some damage on the transfer tube that looks like a puncture mark going in. And that would be consistent with a pressure vessel on the outside letting go so hard that it sends debris inwards, and then the damage there causes the tank to unzip. That's what I'm feeling. I've heard a lot of people whispering the same thing, and that is really unfortunate because this is the second problem that SpaceX has had on Starship with composite overwrap pressure vessels. You can have a lot of people work really hard to build these amazing vehicles weld them together, and it only takes one person to accidentally ding a pressure vessel like this, and then it lets go when the thing is pressurized. So I think there will be questions asked and some training done, and hopefully we won't see this again. Okay, a German satellite manufacturer, D-Cubed, they've announced that they are going to be trying to manufacture solar panels in space for, to sell these things. So this is going to start with a mission next year with a spacecraft called D-Cube-1. It's a small CubeSat that's going to manufacture a small section of a panel, like just manufacture the boom apparently. Then they're going to launch a larger one, which will print a 1 meter long in-space solar panel aboard their next space van mission. And then finally, they're actually going to launch and test this whole panel. Again, this is a very cool idea because solar panels are semiconductor materials. They work well if you can operate them in a vacuum. So I can see why people would be trying to make solar panels in space to make better solar panels. In the US, Redwire has secured a $44 million deal to develop a super low Earth orbit, a very low Earth orbit satellite. So they have a spacecraft design called SaberSat, and it has an air-breathing electric propulsion engine. The idea is the air comes in an intake at one side, it gets electrically charged and then blown out the other side at higher speeds. It obviously has a solar panel to keep this running, and it enables them to operate at altitudes below 200 kilometers, where satellites would normally deorbit very, very quickly. So this is a contract from DARPA. I'm not sure when this is going to launch, but it definitely looks like an interesting thing. Okay, stepping away from the spaceflight to the astronomy side of things, NASA had a whole press conference where they showed off all the photos they had taken of Comet at 3I Atlas using spacecraft around Mars, using spacecraft looking at the sun, using spacecraft in deep space. Now, none of these images is particularly interesting scientifically compared to the kind of things we're getting from telescopes that can do spectroscopy, but nonetheless, this is a really interesting capability. First of all, some of this stuff is useful for astrometry purposes, but also this is the only time we will ever get to see this object, so it makes total sense to try employing this armada of spacecraft which just happen to be closer to it than Earth. I think this was a great little bit of work by NASA, and I hoped that some actual good science comes out of it. Elsewhere, as I said, New Glenn, they had their launch delayed because of the solar storms, a coronal mass ejection running into the Earth and creating a geomagnetic storm. Well, scientists now believe they have detected the signature of a coronal mass ejection around another star. This is a red dwarf that was, I don't actually know how far away it is, but they were surveying like thousands, something like 86,000 nearby stars using something called the low frequency array. And they found a signature type 2 radio burst, which is what we believe a coronal mass ejection generates. So their model shows that this star generated a large CME with a speed of 2,400 kilometers per second. This was very, very cool to be able to see this kind of event around another star. If life is going to have a hard time evolving around stars that generate such high energy blasts of material, although these are smaller stars in the sun that don't put out as much energy, the energy changes a lot, and that could make it hard for life to form. Speaking of energetic events, in Sweden, Saab, the aerospace and defense contractor rather than the car manufacturer, they are investing $10 million into Python. You might remember Python. Their approach to safety is questionable at best. But they are a domestic company that is working on launch vehicles. So Sweden wants to get in the launch vehicle business, and excitement looks to be guaranteed from Python. In Spain, PLD Space released a bunch of photos of their Mayura 5 rocket. This is a full-scale qualification unit which they're going to use for various tests, including taking it to the US to actually they'll take one of these to the US to perform a destructive test using the flight termination system. They're going to do prop loading tests, but ultimately the Mayura 5 is hoped to be able to carry small satellites to orbit. I'm not sure how it's going to compete in today's market, but it's very cool again to see countries doing this. Now, speaking about small rockets, Many of you, of course, have played with model rockets, and you probably know about Estes Rockets, who make the small model kits and the small model rocket motors. Well, back in 2021, they actually spun off a section of a company called Estes Energetics. They were making larger rocket motors for defense. They also make things like black powder for people that want to work with old-fashioned firearms. Well, that Estes Energetics is now being acquired by Voyager Technologies, so they're now actually officially part of a space company. So that's fascinating. Okay, so that's all the news I have for you. I hope we find out more about what happened to Booster 18 in the next week or so. As I speak, they are literally rolling a crane out there to try to stabilize it. That is a very risky operation. More might happen on that front. But actually looking forward, we're going to see the launch of Soyuz MS-28 next week with NASA astronaut Christopher Williams. That'll be his debut spaceflight. He's going to be flying with Sergei Kurtcherkov and Sergei Mikhailov. Also, West Coast people can expect Transporter 15 to launch from Vandenberg, and that'll include a return to launch site. And if you have Thanksgiving week off, might be cool to visit Vandenberg and hear the sonic boom for yourselves. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.